This is Janus Dispatch. Architecture over narrative. Dispatch 2 in the Rented Deflation series. Rented Deflation on Flare. FIP 16. Fix the math. The route stays open. A dispatch on FLR tokenomics. It works as its own blade. No prior reading required. For 2 years, the sharpest argument against FLR was mechanical. Emission diluted the token faster than the protocol grew. Inflation at 5% outran fee burns by orders of magnitude, and the token leaked value by construction. If you held FLR, the supply curve was quietly working against you, every block. The FIP 16 upgrade closed that gap. Inflation dropped from 5% to 3%. Fee burns now scale with usage. A mechanism called FIRE captures protocol fees and MEV and routes them into FLR buybacks. The arithmetic that used to be the bear case now points the other way. At sufficient scale, the network turns deflationary. The thing that was a risk in the thesis is now written up as a driver. That is a real reversal, and it deserves to be stated plainly before anything else. The mechanism is well built, and the direction is right. But the reversal of one argument is not the resolution of the question underneath it. It is the relocation of that question. The new address is harder to find. What FIP 16 actually solved? Gross inflation was the visible problem, and a visible problem is the kind that gets fixed. Reduced emission and FIRE buybacks together improve the supply math. At net inflation between 2.5% and 3%, and lower as ecosystem activity scales, FLR now runs below the trajectory of most major fiat currencies on the same metric. On a spreadsheet, the lines that used to diverge now converge. Anyone who modeled FLR as a slow bleed has to retire that model. So grant the upgrade its win in full. It did not paper over the dilution problem. It addressed the arithmetic of it directly. The skeptic who keeps repeating the old 5% inflation line is fighting a war that ended. The honest move is to accept the fix and then ask what it did not touch. Trace where the fees come from. FIRE captures fees and MEV from on-chain activity. The buybacks are only as large as that activity, so the entire deflationary case rests on a single load-bearing assumption, that the activity is real. Today, on Flare, the bulk of that activity is rented. Total value locked is pulled onto the chain by rewarded Flare emissions, paid out of a separate cross-chain incentive pool. Under the upgrades revenue rules, FIRE collects fees from a mix of sources: data connector requests, facets minting, FXRP flows, MEV capture. The data connector layer and the broader Oracle infrastructure provide an organic baseline of fee burn that runs partly independent of DeFi incentives. The remaining sources depend on the DeFi liquidity, which today is overwhelmingly rented. The path from dilution to buyback is not direct, it is behavioral. The emission recruits the activity whose fees, via FIRE, repurchase the token. The instrument printing the reward is not the instrument capturing the fee, but the recruited activity ties them together. At best, this is a wash. At worst, if the rewarded Flare emission exceeds the fee capture it eventually drives, it is net dilution wearing the costume of deflation. Either way, the buyback rests on activity recruited by emission. Strip the recruitment, and the only question left is what surplus the venues produce on their own. Yield on TVL is the tell. Subsidized TVL produces no real economic yield. It produces yield paid out of fresh emission. That is redistribution, not value creation. A transfer from the token's holders to the capital that showed up to collect the subsidy. Capital you have to pay to keep is not an asset on the balance sheet. It is a liability. Yield on TVL sounds like a metric of success, but it describes the cost of renting a number that looks like adoption. The capital is there because it is paid to be there. It will leave the moment the payment stops being worth more than the risk. The shape this leaves on a dashboard is unmistakable. On Spectra, on Flare today, the staked XRP curve holds nearly all of its visible liquidity in the single rewarded pool. The SFLR curve sits at almost the same number, 2 assets, 1 signature. Rented TVL does not form a term structure. It forms a magnet point. The bipartisan evidence is documented in the companion essay, No Curve Yet, by Design. Who funds the circle? The deflation story is not a side effect. It is the acquisition mechanism. It draws in FLR buyers who believe they are joining a deflationary trajectory, and their capital is the external fuel that keeps the loop solvent. They are the bid against which mercenary liquidity providers sell the rewards they farmed. Value moves in one direction, from the buyers who came for the narrative to the providers who came for the subsidy. The story about deflation is the marketing that brings in the people who pay for the activity. That is not an accusation of bad faith by anyone in particular. It is just the shape of the cash flow when the TVL is rented, and the narrative is the funnel. There is one observable corollary. The actors who fund the rotation do not push promotion in steady-state weeks. They push it in the days before a maturity event, exactly when an unrolled handoff would otherwise be visible as outflow. The marketing concentrates at the breaking points of the curve. That is not the timing of confidence. It is the timing of hedge. The one test. There is a single question that settles all of this, and it does not require a model. Remove the subsidy. Does the TVL stay? If it stays, the activity was organic, the fees are real, and the deflation is earned. If it leaves, the activity was rented, and the deflation was subsidized redistribution all along. The litmus is the behavior of the rewards cliff. A subsidy that is allowed to expire is a subsidy that was bootstrapping something real. A subsidy that is extended again and then again is a quiet admission that the demand never arrived, and the chain cannot stand without the drip. Why this is not the baby and the bathwater. None of this makes FIP 16 a mistake, and none of it makes subsidy inherently fraudulent. Subsidy as bootstrapping is one of the most legitimate moves in the playbook when it ignites a demand side that becomes self-sustaining. Ethereum's liquidity mining back in 2020 was subsidized, and it became organic because real borrow demand stood behind the incentives. The emission was ignition. The engine then ran on its own. So the question for Flare is narrow and answerable. Is the subsidy ignition or life support? Ethereum had borrowers who wanted to borrow before the incentives arrived and after they tapered. Flare's demand side, cover markets, fixed-term lending, decentralized perpetuals, and organic borrow appetite is still mostly pending. The unsubsidized version of that experiment already ran. More markets attracted $40 million of organic TVL across XRP, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and NEAR, with zero incentives, and closed in December 2025 because the borrower side never showed up. Without duration, fixed rate, fixed term, a DeFi loan is an open position revalued every block. Smart money knows this. No CFO levers a balance sheet against an oracle that can glitch at 3 in the morning. Supply can be organic and still find no counterparty. Until the demand side appears, the subsidy on flare is not priming a market. It is the market. The upgrade fixed the gross inflation problem correctly. It did not and could not answer whether the activity it now monetizes is ignition or a feeding tube. Rooted closure, the formal name for what's missing. The mechanism described above has an academic name. In a working paper from late May, Zhubin Luo, a researcher at the Southwestern University of Finance and Economics, introduces routed closure as a diagnostic for decentralized ecosystems. The test has 2 stages. Captured value supports sustainability only when it passes a verifiable route to the critical incentive recipients and is large enough to cover their ongoing rewards. The first stage decides whether captured value counts. The second decides whether it is enough. The framework names 4 breakpoints where decentralized systems fail closure. The fourth, called issuance or market dependence, is where critical rewards rely mainly on inflation, subsidies, token price, or new buyers, rather than external service payments. That is the formal name for what this essay has been calling rented deflation. The rewards loop on flare is a textbook case of the fourth breakpoint. The rewards flow, the activity follows the rewards, and the fire buyback that closes the deflation story is bounded by fees that themselves depend on the subsidy. The framework also disciplines what counts as an external use fee. The conservative version of the numerator subtracts rebates, emissions, and self-dealing, because subsidy-funded activity cannot be its own coverage. Applied to flare, the aggregated fees number that looks like organic economic activity contains lending interest paid by borrowers who borrow to farm rewards. That activity is not external use, it is subsidy circulation. The figure that survives the deduction is closer to what users actually pay at the application layer. On flare today, that figure is an order of magnitude smaller than the rewards distribution it depends on. Rooted closure is not a verdict, it is a discipline. Do not count captured value as reward funding until you can show the root and the coverage. Rented deflation, in this language, is a coverage claim made before root admissibility has been shown. The question, relocated. The thesis question has moved, not closed. It is no longer whether emission outruns demand. The upgrade settled that. It is whether organic activity outruns subsidized activity. The supply math works on paper for as long as the TVL is rented, which is precisely the interval in which it tells you nothing. The watcher's job is not to celebrate the deflation or to dismiss it. It is to hold both faces at once and watch the one number that cannot lie. What happens to the chain when the subsidy stops? 2 health checks carry that number: the trajectory of a facets and FXRP volume that feeds fire, and the behavior of the rewards cliff. Everything else is narrative. I run that second health check daily on the Spectra yield curve on flare. Weeks of daily tracking and a live cliff on June 4th in a companion field report. No curve yet, by design. This piece is the principle. That one is the instrument. Until that number exists, deflation is a hypothesis dressed as a mechanism. FIP16 built a good engine. Whether it runs on fuel or on its own exhaust is the only thing left worth measuring. That was Janus Dispatch. Sources, charts, and disclosure are in the published post. Next dispatch in the series asks what would actually fill the demand-side gap. It names the gears, duration, insurance, options, and the flywheel they form when an ecosystem chooses to subsidize the right side of the market. If this dispatch sharpened your read, subscribe so the next one lands in your inbox. Janus Dispatch is at janusthewatcher.substack.com. The long arguments are in the books. The transition sequence, 2 volumes, 1 thesis. The ground is shifting. Book 1, The Proto-Post-National Age. Book 2, The Frame. Available on Amazon, paperback, and Kindle. The dispatches connect. The books carry the weight. Architecture over narrative.